In session 1, I covered in detail the sequence of events that takes place in the honeybee colony leading up to the issue of a swarm. In this session, I will cover swarm departure. In particular, I will cover these subjects: the temporary cluster site, scouting and site selection, departure to the new nest site, and success criteria and swarming economics. Tom Seeley in Honeybee Democracy writes about how a swarm of honeybees achieves a form of collective intelligence in the choice of its new home. When the conditions are right, about a third of the worker bees stay at home and rear a new queen, while the other 2/3 of the workforce, maybe 10,000 or more bees, fly off with the old queen to create a daughter colony. They travel only about 30 meters before settling into a swarm cluster, and there they will remain for several hours or even days. A few hundred scout bees have been and continue to explore about 70 square kilometres, which is 30 square miles, of the surrounding landscape for potential new homes. They will locate maybe a dozen or more potential sites. They will evaluate each one against certain criteria and democratically select one, usually the best site for the new colony. Then, shortly after completing the selection process, all the bees in the swarm take off en masse and fly straight to their new home in a tree cavity or roost base a couple of miles away. This is a truly remarkable process and one that continues to fascinate me. What are we going to do now is examine how the bees make such a complex decision, how they get that decision right, and how they stay together on the flight to their new home. Most of the more recent research is being carried out by Professor Tom Seeley from Cornell University, following on the work of Martin Lindauer, and the content of this presentation is largely based on his finding. Tom Seeley describes swarm intelligence, a means whereby a group can overcome some of the limitations of its members for the good of the whole, and he suggests that it can have relevance to other animals, including humans. For example, democratic elections or committee meetings. I think Professor Seeley has forgotten one thing in making that statement: the human ego, lol. I don't think bees have egos, but who am I to disagree with the professor? A swarm will usually issue from a hive about noon and will settle about 20 or 30 meters from the parent colony, usually in a tree or suitable hanging post. A few workers will alight and attract other workers to join them by releasing nasnab gland pheromone. This will attract the queen, who joins them, and her 9-ODA pheromone provides cohesion until eventually all the bees gather around her in a quiet cluster. This is only a temporary resting site before the eventual move to a new nest site. Scouting for the new nest site now begins in earnest. Bernd Heinrich, insect physiologist and pioneer of temperature control studies in insects, discovered that bees in a swarm control the temperature without expending much of their onboard energy supply, i.e. the honey in their crops. At air temperatures of about 10 Celsius, the resting metabolism of a swarm, the metabolism that occurs without shivering the flight muscles, is enough to keep the swarm's core at 35 Celsius and the mantle, the outside layer, above 17 Celsius. When the temperature falls below 17 Celsius, the mantle bees crowd inward, causing the cluster to shrink, its porosity to decrease, and its heat loss to diminish. By doing this, the mantle bees effectively trap the metabolic heat from the thousands of resting bees inside the swarm cluster, and they also keep sufficiently warm. It is only when the temperature drops below about 10 Celsius that the mantle bees generate heat by shivering their flight muscles. You can see in figure 2 how a swarm regulates its collective temperature at different ambient temperatures. On the left, it is only about 5 Celsius and the bees are having to work hard, vibrating their flight muscles to maintain the core temperature at 35 Celsius and the mantle temperature at 19 Celsius. On the right, we see that it is a hot day, 30 Celsius ambient temperature, and apart from the scout bees, most of them are resting up. The channels between the bees allow air to circulate by convection, and this keeps the core at the usual 35 Celsius with the mantle temperature at 31 Celsius. Nest site inspections begin about 3 days before the emergence of the swarm and will involve 300 to 500 scout bees, about 5% of the adult bee population. This is just giving the scout bees a head start, however. in their search as they cannot communicate the location, as any waggle dancing will be confused with the waggle dancing foragers. Research by Professor Seeley shows that each bee will inspect a potential site for up to 1 hour by taking minute-long excursions inside the cavity. They will walk about 60 meters inside the cavity and cover all of the surface, possibly measuring the volume. This is alternated with trips outside the cavity. When the bee seems satisfied, it will return to the swarm cluster and perform a waggle dance. The more vigorous waggle dancers recruit more scouts who will check out the potential site, and if they agree, they'll return and perform the same dance. The site selection criteria for honeybees has been well researched. They want a cavity volume of about 40 litres. In fact, it was between 20 and 80 litres in experiments. A height entrance to the hive at about 5 metres, and the entrance preferences the area of about 10 to 15 centimetres squared near the bottom of the cavity, south facing. According to Winston, they will set up their new home at about 100 to 400 metres distance from the parent colony. If it is furnished with comb, it is particularly attractive to the bees. The height of 5 metres is interesting, and I tested it out by accident one year. I caught 14 swarms in bait hives furnished with old comb in several of my apiaries in Scotland, and every single one of them was on the ground. At my home apiary, I caught 3 swarms in such hives, but the bait hive, 10 foot up on the shed roof, even though only yards away from the others, it didn't catch a single swarm. So, work that one out. I aim to ask Professor Seeley next time I see him. It may be something to do with his research took place in a forest where there are plenty of tree cavities as well as hungry birds. Entrance shape, cavity draftiness and dryness didn't affect the bees' selection criteria at all. In fact, Professor Seeley drilled holes in quite a few of the bait boxes he used, and the bees moved in anyway and simply filled in the holes with propolis. The discovery that swarm bees use debate to aggregate dispersed information was made by Martin Lindau in 1951 and 1952, when he received permission from Carl von Frisch to use all the swarms that emerged from the hives kept in the garden behind the Zoological Institute at the University of Munich. He noticed dirty dancing bees on the surface of a swarm. Black with soot, he reported, or red with brick dust, and sniffing the bees black with soot, he was reminded of the aroma of a chimney sweep. The bees were in fact checking out the old chimneys and bombed out buildings. The supporters of the best sites advertises it the most strongly with more vigorous dancers and then in more quantity. To be precise, the scout bee from the best site produced the greatest number of dance circuits per bee on average. Professor Seeley states that consensus is achieved when a threshold of 20 to 30 bees are at a particular nest site. These return to the cluster and dance very vigorously, thus recruiting more bees. When one group of dancing bees is dominant, the dancing stops. Here we have an illustration of what Tom Seeley calls a quorum response. Top to bottom we've got 10 AM, 1 PM and 4 PM. In this illustration, 2 scout bees find 2 potential nest sites simultaneously, one with a large entrance hole on the left and one with a smaller, more desirable entrance hole on the right. Both bees return to the swarm and start waggle dancing, but the scout bee from the right tree performs 3 times as many waggle dance circuits, shown in blue, as the scout bee from the left tree. The result is that 3 hours later, support for the right tree has increased 6-fold. After 3 more hours, consensus is built and the left tree is effectively eliminated from consideration. How do the house hunting bees reach consensus? We have already seen that the turbulent debate among the scout bees supporting different options is at the heart of it. These groups compete to gain additional members from a pool of scout bees who are not yet committed to a site. Whichever group first attracts a quorum of supporters wins the competition, and when they eventually leave for their new home, they are on complete agreement about the flight path. The house hunting bee shows a clever way to make an accurate consensus decision, whilst also saving some time. They do this by the scout bees making sharp changes in their behaviour when a threshold number of individuals support one of the alternatives. They return to the swarm cluster to perform piping signals, and this induces the many thousands of non-scout bees to warm their flight muscles in preparation for flight to their chosen nest site. Professor Seeley suggests the piping also tells the scout bees from the other non-chosen sites to stop advertising and visiting these sites, and this also speeds up the consensus. He calls this behaviour quorum response. The waggle dance itself is used by foragers to show good forest sites over 100 metres away and by scout bees to indicate positions of a potential nest site. 1 second of the waggle run equates to 1,000 metres in distance. In the dark of the hive, the sun is always up with regards to bees dancing, and bees can detect gravity using the hairs on the back of their neck. But on the temporary swarm cluster, the bees can see the sun, so the direction of the waggle run is actually the correct direction of the nest site. Professor Seeley found that in deciding which site to choose, the scouts would also employ another tactic in addition to the positive reinforcement achieved by dancing. They also had a stop signal, a booming headbutt. When choosing between two nest sites, the scout bees committed to each nest site would direct these headbutts to the scouts promoting the other box, thus setting up a cross-inhibition between the two populations of scout bees. The honeybee stop signal is a vibrational signal that lasts about 150 milliseconds and has a fundamental frequency around 350 Hz. It is typically delivered by the sender butting her head against the dancer. Although the dancer may not show an immediate response to the signal, the accumulation of such stop signals is seen to increase the probability that the bee will cease dancing and is used during forage, for example, if a bee is being attacked at a particular location, and in decision making by the scout bees on the swarm cluster. This is a diagram from Honeybee Democracy, and it shows swarm scout bees in a prolonged debate that lasted 3 days. The swarm was set up at 2:30 p.m, but it was not until the middle of the next day that scout bees started advertising potential nest sites with their dancers. 6 sites between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. with A, 2,200 metres to the east, in the lead with 8 dancing bees. Over the next 4 hours, 3 more sites, G, H and I, were entered into discussion, and 4 sites, A, B, D and G, were at the forefront. Site A was losing its lead as B, 900 metres to the south, and G, 1,400 metres southwest, gained more support. Between 3 and 5 p.m, only 4 bees danced for A, whereas 17 bees danced for B, and 10 did so for G. At 5 p.m, B and G were pretty even, but between 5 and 7 p.m, although bees danced for 7 sites, only B and G received support of multiple dancing bees. On the next day, between 7 and 9 a.m, both B and G were being advertised by about a dozen dancing bees. At 9 a.m, Site G began to build a commanding lead over Site B, with 32 versus 17 bees between 9 and 11 a.m, and 20 versus 4 between 11 and 11:54. At 11:54 it started raining, and this carried on all afternoon and night until 8 a.m. on the next day. At 9 a.m, when they resumed dancing, the bees showed unanimous support, 73 out of 73 bees for Site G in the southwest, and at 11:58 the swarm flew off to their new home in the southwest. Amazing. After analysing the figures from his observation on swarms, Professor Seeley got a clear picture of the main features of the scout bees' decision-making process. The bees' debate starts slowly with an information accumulation phase. Many widely scattered alternatives are on the table for discussion. The bees' debate ends with all of the dancing bees advocating one site, and consensus has been reached. The bees' decision-making process is a highly distributed and thus a democratic one involving hundreds of individuals. Or is it? If the scout bees make up about 5% of the adult population in the hive, and there are only a few hundred of them in the swarm, and they make the decision, I would argue that it is not actually a democracy at all, as many thousands of bees in the swarm have no say at all in the decision-making process. But who am I to oppose Professor Seeley? Bernd Heinrich also discovered the requirement for honeybees in a swarm to warm their wing muscles to at least 35 Celsius before takeoff, although he was not aware of the process by which all the bees in a swarm attain the temperature at the same time. Decision reached, the scout bees initiate the move and signal to the swarm bees that they need to warm up their flight muscles, as I said, to 35 Celsius to be ready to fly. 1 hour before takeoff, the scout bees start piping, and this builds to a climax just prior to takeoff. The piping noise is generated by a worker bee pressing her thorax with wings pulled tightly together over the abdomen onto another bee. Whilst doing this, she activates her wing muscles, producing the piping sound, described by Professor Seeley as a sound resembling a Formula One car revving up. These piping bees run around and through the swarm cluster excitedly, pausing now and again to pipe. Some of the scout bees shake the cooler mantle bees to wake them up when departure is imminent. A shaker bee grasps her sister and shakes her body for 1 to 2 seconds at 16 to 18 Hz, but the most important signal is the buzz run. Here we can see bees on the surfaces of a swarm photographed by an infrared video camera. On the left, it is 15 minutes before takeoff, on the right 1 minute before takeoff. The scale bar is in Celsius, measuring from about 77 Fahrenheit from the darkest to about 106 Fahrenheit to the lightest. It clearly shows how the bees increase their temperature in order to fly, indicated by the lighter colours on the right. Piping by worker bees is a single pulse of sound, and it lasts about 1 second at a frequency of 200 to 250 Hz, plus many harmonics up to 2000 Hz. It stimulates the bees to prepare for takeoff. The bees performing the buzz run are also the scout bees, and they run towards a group of torpid bees, and seconds later spreads her wings and buzzes them as she makes contact with the cluster. She pushes through them, still buzzing her wings noisily when contact is broken, and often takes flight before rejoining the cluster to repeat the process. It is possible she senses the swarm bee's temperature as she presses against them, as research has shown that it takes off only a few seconds after 100% of the bees have warmed themselves up to 35 Celsius, and off they go. Lindau reported that buzz runners are prominent on the swarm cluster in the final few minutes before takeoff starts, and he suggested that by barging and boring through the cluster, the buzz runners disperse the interconnected bees and so initiate their concerted takeoff. Professor Seeley tested this hypothesis with a series of tests which confirmed that Lindau was right. He also discovered that 5 minutes before takeoff, more than 80% of running bees produce buzz runs. The buzz run is seen in only one context, when bees are being stimulated to take flight. Professor Seeley further hypothesized that the scout bees, as well as being information integrators and group activators, are also mobile temperature sensors, in that when performing the buzzing run, they are testing the temperature of each bee they come into contact with, and thus the buzz runners know when the whole swarm is at the correct temperature, 35 Celsius, to be able to take off simultaneously. We've already pondered on the wondrous task that enables a school bus-sized swarm of about 10,000 bees to fly straight from the clustered site direct to the new dwelling place with ease, when only about 5% of the swarm actually know where they are going. The distance can be up to several miles away, and as the swarm closes on the new site, it lowers its speed so that it stops precisely and gracefully at the entrance to the new home. Queen 9-ODA pheromone, streaker bees, and Nasonov pheromone play important roles in the journey. Streaker bees, about 500 of them, are the original scout bees, and they take on the role of steering the swarm to the new site. They fly backwards and forwards at a speed of 20 miles per hour at the top of the swarm cloud, releasing their Nasonov pheromone. The swarm bees follow them and also are attracted to the Queen 9-ODA pheromone. Tom Seeley's experiments showed that the cloud of swarming bees hung over the cluster site for about 30 seconds after takeoff, then began moving slowly in the direction of the new nest site. It covered the first 30 meters at less than 1 kilometre an hour, but accelerated steadily so that after 150 meters it had reached its top speed of 8 kilometers per hour. Just about 90 meters from the new site, the swarm gradually decreased in speed before coming to a halt in mid-air within 5 meters of the nest entrance. Over the next 2 minutes, scout bees arrived at the entrance in increasing numbers, releasing nest-off pheromone to guide the swarm into the nest. Within 3 minutes, the bees were landing on the lighting board, and within 10 minutes, most of the swarm had entered the nest. Job done? Well, not really, because the following weeks and months are also dangerous times for the swarm, and their survival really does hang in the balance. The success criteria is based on population growth. Population growth is affected by various factors, including the availability of food, the ease with which a colony can control its hive environment. For example, colonies with damp floors have more difficulty rearing brood. The age of the queen. Young queens generally lay more eggs than an old queen, and the presence of disease or absence of disease. Success is also dependent on the time of year, because late swarms have less time to build up in temperate climates. The weather, so if it's cold and raining for a month after the swarm moves in, they will likely run out of stores and starve. Whether it's a prime swarm or aftercast, an aftercast has far less bees and a virgin queen, so may struggle to build up. And also queen mating success, a virgin has to successfully mate, and weather can affect that as well. As a swarm contains bees of all ages, as soon as the swarm moves into its new home, the population is declining due to the natural death rate. The colony's survival is dependent on the bees clearing out the old nest site, making new comb from the honey in their crops, collecting nectar to enable more comb to be built, collecting and storing pollen, and most importantly, the queen needs to lay eggs to replace the dying bees as soon as she can. Only a quarter of swarms survive, according to Winston, and 80% of swarms moving into natural cavities fail to survive the first winter, according to Professor Seeley. So the next time you decide to let your bees swarm and move into the nearby woods, that's if they don't move into your neighbour's chimney, remember that their survival is far from certain. That's the end of session 2. If you join me for session 3, I will be looking at what happens in the parent colony after the main swarm leaves, including the issuing of caste, what happens with controlled swarming when the beekeeper intervenes, compared to uncontrolled swarming when the bees are in charge. Thank you for those subscribers who have bought me a beer. Adios amigos, until the next time.